In the autumn of 1913, with the leaves along the Hudson just beginning to curl and fall, a retired schoolteacher turned part-time archivist named Lenora Beckett sat hunched over a wooden table in the records room of the Dutchess County Historical Society. The air was dry and thick with paper dust, a silence only interrupted by the occasional thud of a leather-bound ledger or the soft click of a filing drawer closing. Lenora had been tasked with reorganizing misfiled family records from the late 18th century, many of which had been stored improperly during renovations after a fire in 1894. She wasn't expecting anything unusual. Just faded ink, marriage licenses, property deeds, and the ghosts of once busy names now silenced by time. But somewhere between a worn-out box marked Pettigrew 1789 and another labeled Wainscot 1797, she found an envelope with no date, no surname. Just one brittle photograph stuck inside a thin fold of parchment protected by nothing more than a dried leaf that crumbled when touched. The image was too crisp, too formal for its surroundings, a daguerreotype of a family posed stiffly before a plain wooden cabin. A man with sunken cheeks, a woman with her hands hidden inside her apron, and 5 children arranged from tallest to smallest. None of them smiled. Not even the littlest girl whose feet didn't touch the floor of the bench she sat on. Lenora stared at the image longer than she meant to. Something about their eyes. The father's were slightly uneven, one socket resting lower than the other as if his skull had been molded off-center. The mother had no eyebrows, just pale skin that caught the light and reflected it like polished porcelain. The children each seemed older than they should be, stoic, still, too still. When Lenora flipped the photo over, she found a handwritten note in the corner. Patterson family, Holbrook Township, 1795. But that made no sense. Holbrook wasn't a current town. In fact, it hadn't appeared on any New York State map for over a century. Curious, she began to cross-reference town directories, cemetery logs, church registries. There was no record of any Pattersons living in Holbrook, no record of the township itself after 1803, no grave markers, no census entries, no birth or death certificates. Just that one photo. It was as if the family had been plucked from existence after that moment was captured. Most unsettling of all, the back of the parchment included a faint etching, barely visible unless tilted to the window light, showing 7 small X's arranged in a circle with a larger one marked at the center. It looked like a burial map. But when Lenora brought it to a cartographer at the local university, he confirmed that no such burial grounds existed, nor had they ever been recorded. She took it further. Spent weeks combing through legislative archives, church tithing rolls, tax filings. Nothing. Every attempt to trace the Patterson name came up empty, save for one obscure mention in an 1804 personal letter stored in the Cornell archives. A minister's wife wrote to her sister about the family that never needed funerals. The ones buried already, she said, in a graveyard no one ever blessed. Lenora grew obsessed. She visited the former site of Holbrook, a thicket of woods and stone ruins overrun with ivy and silence. Local folklore barely remembered it. Some thought the town had burned in a lightning fire. Others said the land was cursed after a child went missing and was never found. But none remembered the Pattersons. When she showed the photograph to old-timers in the neighboring village of Lark Hollow, most shrugged, but one elderly man grew pale. He said the photo reminded him of something his grandfather once told him, that there were once people who lived out past the pines, but they weren't from here. They never came to town except to buy salt, never spoke unless spoken to. And when the youngest boy finally died, they dug a graveyard backwards. When Lenora pressed him to explain, he only muttered, "You bury the dead to rest. They buried theirs to keep them awake." By winter, Lenora had sent letters to every historical society east of the Catskills, The replies all said the same. No record of the Patterson family, no proof of the cemetery, no death notices. Yet here was the photograph, undeniable and intact, a family once real, now erased. And something in the way they sat, too aligned, too symmetrical, suggested they had never been meant to be remembered. She tried to place the photo into the county museum's permanent records, but days before the transfer, the original envelope went missing. All that remained was the image and that same strange silence. A family supposedly buried in a place that never existed. Their only proof of life sealed in silver nitrate, captured in stillness, eyes watching from beyond the grave. And somewhere in the folds of history, beneath layers of forgetfulness and deliberate omission, a question began to press its weight on her chest. What if they weren't the ones who disappeared? What if they were just the beginning? In 1795, Halbrook was a town that lived mostly in silence. The church bells marked the hours, and the creak of wagons over dirt paths was the only sound after dusk. Its people were devout, sober, wary of outsiders. Yet when the Patterson family arrived, no one raised alarm. They claimed to have come from Maine, though no one could name the village they left behind, and no one pressed the matter further. Strangers came and went often in those years, war having scattered families across the frontier. The Pattersons were polite, well-kept, and carried themselves with a reserve that felt respectable in a town built on restraint. Elijah Patterson, tall and thin with a quiet authority, became a figure of trust almost immediately. His wife Ruth kept to herself, her face rarely seen without the pale bonnet that shadowed her brow. Their children were quiet as well, standing close together when in town, never quarreling, never running wild. To many they seemed a model of order. The family settled at the edge of the woods on land most locals avoided. The soil there was stony, damp with shade, and no one had tried to farm it for decades, yet the Pattersons made it livable. Smoke rose steady from their chimney, chickens pecked in neat rows by the garden fence. When Elijah offered to teach the town's children letters and scripture in his barn, parents were grateful. A man willing to take time for the uneducated was a blessing. And the barn soon filled with boys and girls seated on rough benches, eyes fixed on his chalk marks across wood planks. He never asked for payment. He only asked for punctuality. The children spoke of his calm voice, his patience, the way he could make even the dullest boy spell a psalm aloud with pride. In a town where work left little room for gentleness, Elijah's lessons became something close to cherished. But there was something else, something less spoken. Families noticed their children came home from the barn subdued, quieter than before. Some parents thought it was discipline, others thought it reverence. No one imagined it as anything darker. The Pattersons never quarreled in public, never asked for more than what they already had. Ruth was seen in the market buying salt and flour, her hands gloved even in summer heat. The children were seen gathering firewood in the woods, always together, always in step. Their stillness began to seem natural, their silence a kind of grace. In a place where sin was preached against every Sunday, what harm could there be in a family that embodied peace? Over the months, Halbrook forgot the strangeness that usually accompanied outsiders. They forgot to wonder why Elijah knew so many psalms by heart but never joined the hymns in church. They forgot to question why the family never accepted invitations to supper, or why their farm yielded crops despite soil that had starved others. They forgot that no one had ever seen Ruth's face without the bonnet's shadow or the children's eyes without that steady, vacant focus. The Pattersons became part of the town not because they were understood, but because they were accepted without thought. Halbrook was a place eager to move past what unsettled it, and in forgetting their questions they opened the door to something they would never name until it was too late. The barn stood tall at the edge of the trees, its windows shuttered against daylight even when lessons were held. At night, faint lamplight glowed through the cracks long after the children had gone home. The sound of chalk against wood could still be heard, faint scratching in the dark. No one asked why. Halbrook was a town that forgot, and forgetting, it allowed the Pattersons to root themselves deep into its soil, quiet and unseen, where secrets could grow. In the summer of 1796, a year after the Pattersons settled at the edge of the woods, the people of Halbrook began to notice one of the children more than the rest. She was a pale girl, thin as a reed, known only as Anna. Though she was said to be Elijah Patterson's daughter, her features seemed sharper, her skin almost translucent, as if she were made from something brittle that might break with the slightest touch. She seldom spoke, and when she did, her voice rasped as though her throat were filled with gravel. She wore the same faded dress season after season, its collar fastened high, and always, no matter the weather, a ribbon tied snugly around her neck. The ribbon was black, frayed at the ends, and the knot never seemed to change. Some said they had never seen it undone. Anna's weakness drew whispers of pity, but those whispers turned uneasy when her coughing fits began. Neighbors remembered seeing her doubled over in the Patterson yard, red drops staining her apron, her small shoulders jerking with force. Her siblings never rushed to her aid. They only stood nearby, watching silently, until the coughing ceased and she straightened again. That silence was more unsettling than the blood itself. Children in town avoided her, though she never made a move to be near them. Parents watched her with suspicion, uncertain if illness could spread just by being too close. One evening, after a particularly violent episode left Anna spitting blood into her palms, Elijah sent for the midwife, Margaret Drew. Margaret had attended births and sickness in Halbrook for 30 years. She knew the look of failing lungs, of weak hearts, of children marked early for the grave, but Anna was different. Margaret noticed how the girl clutched at her ribbon when she coughed, as though afraid it might slip loose. When Margaret leaned closer, offering to check her breathing, Anna's eyes widened in terror. She shook her head, lips pressed thin, and gripped the ribbon tighter. It was only when the knot shifted slightly that Margaret heard it for the first time. A faint metallic sound, a high, delicate tinkling that did not belong to the room. It came from the girl's throat, as though a bell had been hidden deep within her. Margaret's hands froze. She asked carefully, to see what lay beneath the ribbon. Elijah's face hardened, and he said it was not necessary. Ruth, the mother, looked away. Anna herself let out a low whimper, one hand trembling against the knot. Then another cough seized her, more violent than before. Her body arched. Her limbs stiffened, and that same small bell sound echoed louder now, rattling faintly like metal struck from within. Margaret had seen seizures, but never like this. The sound lodged itself in her memory, unnatural and wrong. When the fit ended, Elijah placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and said quietly that Margaret's services would no longer be needed. He thanked her for coming and shut the door firmly behind her. The next morning, Anna was gone. The Pattersons told neighbors she had been sent away to kin, though they could not name which kin or where. No cart had been seen leaving the property. No footprints led from the cabin. She had vanished as if swallowed whole. Margaret asked once, perhaps twice, but was met with silence. The ribbon was never seen again. Years later, when Margaret recalled that night, she said it was not the coughing that haunted her. It was the sound of that hidden bell, soft but clear, ringing where no bell should be. She said it was not the sound of illness. It was the sound of something bound inside a child's body, something caged and kept alive. And when Anna disappeared, Margaret understood that the ribbon had not been an ornament nor a comfort. It had been a lock. And locks are made not to protect the one who wears them, but to keep what is inside from getting free. In 1816, long after the last of Halbrook's families had scattered and the town itself was erased from maps, a group of descendants returned to the overgrown clearing where the Pattersons' cabin had once stood. They came not for memory but for salvage, tearing down the remnants of the structure for timber and stone. The cabin had sagged inward. Roof collapsed beneath decades of rain and neglect, its walls softened by moss. What remained of its hearth was still upright, blackened brick rising like a monument to fire long dead. It was in dismantling that hearth that they found the thing no one expected, the object buried inside the chimney's throat, rusted but intact. An iron bell, small, chained by a narrow link to the stone itself, as though someone had fixed it in place to keep it from being lost. At first it seemed only a fragment of farm iron, something repurposed or forgotten. But when one of the men turned it over in his hands, the silence broke. A faint sound bubbled from its hollow. Not the clean chime of a bell, but a wet gurgling, as though liquid still lingered in its core after all those years. The sound rose when the bell tilted, then faded as it stilled, repeating again each time it was shifted. Uneasy, they pried it open, striking its rim against stone until the corroded seam split. What spilled out was not ash or soot, but a small, calcified lump. White, jagged at one end, unmistakable, a tooth. No one spoke at first. They only stared. Teeth were not strange to the soil. Animals, even men, had been buried and forgotten. But to find one inside a bell, locked in iron, tethered to the bones of a stove, was something else entirely. It was deliberate. One man muttered that it was a charm, a kind of ward against evil. Another swore it was the opposite, that the bell had been built to hold something in, not to keep anything out. The chain proved it had not been dropped or lost by chance. It had been bound there, meant to stay. They argued over what should be done with it. Some wanted to bury it at once, to cover it again in earth and stone. Others insisted it was proof of what had always been whispered, that the Pattersons were not what they seemed, that their farm had been a place of silence not born from virtue but from things no one dared name. In the end, the bell was carried away, placed into a crate with other salvaged pieces. But it never rang. It never sang like iron should. Only that gurgling sound followed, faint and irregular, like breath caught beneath water. Those who handled it claimed their hands stank for days afterward, a sour odor like rot that soap could not lift. The tooth was kept by one man's son, who wrapped it in cloth and tucked it away in a chest, though he would not explain why. When asked, he only said the thing felt like a marker, that it had belonged to someone whose name was never spoken. The cabin's ruins were stripped until nothing remained but bare stones and the hollow where the cellar had once been. Yet the discovery left a wound. The men whispered that if one bell had been hidden in the hearth, others might have been buried elsewhere, in the soil, in the walls, in places no one would ever think to search. They did not return to check. They left the clearing behind, uneasy, and swore never to speak of the sound again. But some carried it with them anyway, that gurgling echo, that impossible weight of a tooth sealed in iron. Proof not only that the Pattersons had lived there, but that they had left something behind, something no fire could erase. Tucked deep in the dust-choked attic of the old Halbrook Parish archive, beneath a collapsed rafter and behind a crate of cracked hymnals, lay a small book that no one remembered cataloging. Its leather cover was soft with age, the spine stitched by hand, its titleless face marked only by a faint indentation, as if once pressed beneath something heavy and wet. The pages inside were yellowed and thick, curling slightly at the corners, but every one of them appeared blank. No ink, no signature, no notes of authorship, just a ghost of parchment, still intact despite the decades. It was dismissed at first as a misbound journal, the kind old settlers made when paper was scarce and ink scarcer. Yet something about its careful stitching, its worn but intentional cover, kept it from being thrown away. It was set aside, unremarkable, forgotten. It wasn't until years later, during a historical society's effort to restore the town's archival records, that someone revisited the strange little book. An assistant named Thorne, curious about the object, dabbed one of the pages with warm milk after recalling an old folk trick used to reveal hidden ink. He held the paper near the attic's oil lamp. Slowly, lines began to rise, not written as if by pen, but burned backward into the fibers of the page. Ghost letters scorched in reverse, as though intended only for a mirror to read. The words were not scripture, not poetry. They were procedural. They were exact. Thorne copied a few phrases onto a scrap sheet and brought them to his supervisor. Together they decoded a dozen pages. The entries began innocently enough. Methods for preserving perishable material, how to dry and seal animal organs, how to bind tissue for long storage. But the deeper they read, the more precise the language became, and the more human it sounded. One passage described the delicate separation of the voice chamber from the throat column, warning against damage to the fine threads within the cords. Another detailed how to soak them in brine for a week, then transfer them to a tincture made of crushed violet petals, salt, and mercury scraped from mirrored glass. It was not medicine. It was not science. It was preservation with intent, ritualistic, obsessive, clinical in its cruelty. Page after page revealed techniques for handling parts of the body no one ever named aloud. If preserved properly, one entry read, the cord may retain echo, a remnant breath. Do not allow light to touch it. Another simply stated, the bell must remain with the throat, or it will forget the tone. No names were ever written, no attributions. But at the back of the book, in the deepest corner of the binding, was a mark scratched in. Barely visible unless the page was peeled away from the spine. It read, Property of E.P. Those initials were known to few outside the records room, Elijah Patterson. The discovery was not shared publicly. The book was locked away, sealed in a box, stored in the basement beneath the courthouse for decades. Only 3 people were known to have read it cover to cover. One left town within the month. Another went blind within the year. The third, Thorne, was found dead in his home, slumped over a boiling pot of milk with burns covering both arms. The book had disappeared from his possessions entirely, and yet copies of certain pages continued to surface, whispered among archivists and collectors, sent anonymously with no return address. The methods were consistent, the language unchanged, the voice preserved, and somewhere the memory of Elijah Patterson lingered not in tombstone or birth record, but in heat-reactive parchment, a book that spoke only when burned, revealing not prayers but instructions for keeping something alive long after the body had gone still. The boys were always there before first light, still as fence posts lined up along the edge of the Patterson property where the split-rail boundary met the woods. They didn't speak. They didn't wave. They didn't move. Just watched, day after day, eyes locked forward as if waiting for something no one else could see. There were 3 of them, all close in age, each with the same sunken cheeks and thin, weatherless faces that seemed too calm for children. And none of them ever blinked. The neighbors said they tried not to look too long. There was something wrong in the way the boys held still, something not quite human in their restraint. Livestock would avoid them. Dogs refused to pass the fence line, tails tucked, whining as if scenting something buried just beneath the soil. At first, the townsfolk chalked it up to strict parenting. Elijah Patterson was known to value discipline, and the boys, Samuel, Abram, and Jude, were said to follow his every word without question. But over time, the oddness deepened. No one had ever seen them sleep. Even at night, when their cabin windows flickered faintly with lamplight, a neighbor out walking to check his traps once glimpsed all three boys standing inside, upright, eyes wide, unmoving. It was as though they were kept on watch, not just by their father, but by something inside them that refused rest. One Sunday, after a storm had washed out part of the main road, the town doctor was called to the Patterson home. Ruth said Jude had fallen from the loft and injured his back. The doctor, an old man named Harlan Finch, arrived with his bag, expecting bruises or perhaps a cracked rib. What he found instead left him white-faced. The boy sat on a stool, shirt removed, and down the length of his spine was a clean, deliberate incision, roughly stitched, as though someone had opened him carefully and sewn him closed again. But that wasn't what made Harlan step back. It was what he felt, or didn't feel, when he pressed his fingers to the wound. There was no vertebral ridge, no resistance, just soft tissue. A hollow. He asked Elijah what procedure had been done, who had closed the wound, and Elijah simply replied, "We do what's necessary to keep what's inside from floating loose." The doctor didn't stay long. He left without dressing the injury, without collecting payment. He refused to return even when Ruth asked again a few weeks later. Years later, in a journal left to his son, Harlan wrote only one line about the visit. "The boy has no spine, and yet he stands." Rumors spread quietly beneath the hum of normal life. Some claimed the boys were not Elijah's sons, but something else entirely, borrowed or built. Others swore they never aged, that Samuel looked the same at 12 as he had at 8. One woman said she saw him in the market a full year after his supposed death from illness. No one spoke these things aloud. Halbrook had a habit of swallowing its discomforts, but the boys stood at that fence day after day, season after season, eyes unblinking, backs stiff, the stitched one walking slower than the others but never falling behind. It was said that when one finally stopped standing, when Jude disappeared and was never spoken of again, the other two didn't flinch. They simply stood closer together, watched longer, waited, as though the space between them had always been meant for something that hadn't yet arrived. And still, they did not sleep. In the early 1900s, when the remnants of the Patterson property were being cleared by descendants of nearby settlers, most assumed the cabin had little left to offer, just rotted beams, collapsed roof lines, and chimney stones moss-thick and sinking. But beneath the rubble, past a warped wooden trapdoor nearly fused shut from rain and rot, they found the entrance to what they believed was a long-forgotten root cellar. It was hidden beneath a layer of sod and firewood, deliberately concealed. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a narrow stone stairwell that spiraled downward in a tight coil, unlike the simple dugouts typical of food storage in the 18th century. The steps were worn in the center as though trod heavily by many feet over many years, though no one in living memory had known it was there. At the bottom, the cellar widened into a low vaulted chamber of cold stone, the walls slick with moisture. There were no shelves, no crates of pickled vegetables, no salt barrels or jars. Instead, there were hooks, dozens of them, embedded directly into the ceiling beams, some rusted, some still sharp. Coiled on the floor beside a wall of stacked stone were ropes, 9 feet long, each tied in a loop at one end, and each cut with eerie precision to match the others exactly. Someone had measured. Someone had made this space with intent. But what disturbed the men most were the markings. Along the far wall, etched into the stone, were shallow scratch marks, hundreds of them, arranged in rows of 7. Tally marks, some carved deep as if made with metal, others lighter as though drawn by fingernails or bone. Each set began below a hook. Each row ended beneath one. There were no names, no initials, just the repetition of time, of passage, of something kept track of long after memory should have faded. Near the back wall was a rusted trough about 5 feet long and scorched black along the bottom. Dried flecks clung to its surface, dark, brittle, embedded into the metal like old blood. No one touched it for long. They assumed it was used for animal slaughter or some primitive butchering, though no bones or remnants of livestock were found. The smell, even after all those decades, was wrong. Not decay, but something sharper, like rust and iron left too long in warm water. For decades, the cellar's findings were whispered about but not investigated. The trough was eventually stored in the town's historical society barn, but the ropes and markings were left undisturbed, the entrance resealed with stone. It wasn't until the 1990s, when a forensic anthropology team was researching colonial burial practices in the region, that someone returned. They took samples from the trough, from beneath the hooks, from the grooves in the walls. The results came back quietly and were never made public, but one of the assistants leaked the findings years later. The dark flecks were confirmed to be human. Blood, traces of connective tissue. One sample contained high concentrations of mercury and salt. Another tested positive for remnants of cartilage consistent with tracheal material. The report used sterile language, ritual residue, non-domestic use, prolonged exposure site. But behind those phrases was a truth no one wanted to say out loud. This had never been a place to store food. It had not been built for winter roots or salted pork. It had been a chamber of purpose, a room for holding, for keeping, for transforming. Something had happened beneath the Patterson home, repeatedly, deliberately, and the cellar remembered, in stone, in rust, in rope length measured just so. No one returned after the tests. The stairwell was filled with concrete, but those tally marks are still there, somewhere beneath the earth, counting things no one dares name. They always said Samuel Patterson was the clever one. Of all the Patterson children, he was the only one who seemed almost normal, at least from a distance. He spoke when spoken to, could recite whole passages of the Bible from memory, and he drew constantly. That's what most remembered. His hands always busy with charcoal or quill, dragging lines across whatever paper he could find. Neighbors recalled seeing him at the edge of church gatherings, hunched over the back of an almanac or a blank hymnal page, sketching silently. At first it was dismissed as harmless, just a boy with a gift. His maps were intricate, beautifully precise, down to the bend of the river and the rise of every low hill surrounding Hallbrook. But over time, people noticed something strange. The places he mapped didn't always match the world they knew. Decades after the Pattersons vanished, one of Samuel's old notebooks turned up in the attic of the abandoned schoolhouse. Bound in cheap twine, its pages warped from damp. It had been slipped behind a false wallboard and left to be forgotten. Inside were over a dozen maps, each drawn with staggering detail, the lines etched deep from repeated tracing. Most began with the familiar. Hallbrook at the center, the church, the fields, the river path to Lark Hollow. But the farther you looked from the center, the more unfamiliar things became. Roads that had never been built, stone bridges spanning creeks no longer visible, forks in the trail that no one remembered walking. The names he gave these paths were stranger still. Hollow Mile, Widow's Pass, Needle Orchard, and one labeled in faint smeared script, Griever's Path. That one stood out. Griever's Path began at the edge of the Patterson property and wound deep into a stretch of forest that modern topographers later confirmed had never been developed. The trail split 3 times before ending in an oval shape labeled simply Rest. Alongside it were dozens of tiny X's arranged in rows, more than 50 in total. Beneath it in red chalk, a single word: remembered. In 1934, a surveyor from the state's historical department used the map as a curiosity during a project to trace lost colonial roads. He followed Samuel Griever's path exactly, bringing with him soil analysis tools, ground-penetrating rods, and a journal for documentation. He found the trail. It was overgrown, but the trees bowed just slightly where the map said they would, and small, moss-covered stones were scattered in strange, deliberate shapes. The oval clearing existed, dead center in the map's final curve, but there were no gravestones, no depressions in the earth, no bones. The soil gave nothing back, and yet something about the air felt wrong there, still heavy, like breath held too long. The birds didn't follow him into the clearing. The rods struck rock just beneath the surface over and over again in rhythmic spacing. Not random, measured, arranged. The surveyor left the site before dusk. He didn't record what he felt there, only wrote in the margin of his journal, "It is not a cemetery, it is the idea of one. It holds memory, not rest." When the notebook was examined again in the 1970s, forensic analysts discovered the paper used in some of the map pages had fibers embedded with human hair, fine, dark, braided into the pulp. Microscopic examination showed that some ink lines were composed not of carbon but of blood diluted with lye. The maps were not just art, they were artifacts. And whoever Samuel was, he had seen a version of the county that did not exist on any official record. Or maybe it had existed once, not above the ground, but beneath it, in a pattern of graves with no bodies, in paths that no longer curved through trees but still pressed their presence into the silence. Samuel had drawn what he knew, what he had walked. A boy with no spine, they once said, but perhaps what he lacked in bone he carried instead in memory. A cartographer of things that should not be mapped. Bet when the Patterson book was first examined under heat and milk, the focus was on the words, the instructions, the rituals, the sickeningly clinical breakdown of human anatomy written in reverse, as though meant for no one but a mirror and the one who already knew what they were reading. But it wasn't until decades later, when a university research team began chemical testing on the aged parchment, that the truth beneath the writing began to surface. The pages were old, brittle, and smelled faintly of iron and rot even after careful preservation. A sample of the ink was scraped from the margin of a page titled "Retaining Echo in Soft Tissue," and what the lab found rewrote everything. It was an ink. Under chemical analysis, the substance revealed itself as hemoglobin-rich, human blood, darkened by time but unmistakably organic. The base compound was consistent with dried plasma, with degraded cells pointing to multiple donors. Intermixed with the blood were particles of ash, likely from burnt wood or bone, and finely crushed violet petals, their pigment still detectable under spectral light. Each entry in the book bore a slightly different mixture, as though the formulas were tailored by purpose or person, or, more chillingly, by outcome. Some samples contained traces of mercury, others specks of ground glass. A few had binding agents made from honey or animal fat, but none followed a predictable pattern. It was experimentation, trial and error, each page a different attempt at permanence. Forensic botanists later confirmed the violet petals used in several samples were from a rare strain native only to northern Maine, supporting the Patterson family's unverified origin story. But when one researcher traced that same strain to a particular patch of woods long thought inaccessible, they found no flowers growing there, only bare earth, low stone circles, and silence. The ingredients had been gathered long ago, cultivated for a purpose no one living could explain. But the most disturbing discovery came not from the ink, but from the structure of the book itself. A conservator attempting to flatten a warped middle section noticed that 2 pages glued tightly at the spine had never been separated. When steamed and gently pried apart, the pages resisted, their fibers sticky, reluctant to let go. Between them, pressed into the paste like a relic hidden in plain sight, was a lock of hair, woven tightly into a miniature braid no longer than a child's finger. The strands were blonde, fine, and held together by a black thread looped into a knot. Beneath the braid, faint and water-stained, was a single line of text, written so lightly it could only be read under angled light. This one sang until the end. No one knew what that meant. No one wanted to. The book was returned to its sealed case, but the samples, photographed, archived, and quietly passed between departments, remained under quiet review. Experts debated whether the formulas were symbolic or functional, whether the instructions were real or some form of psychotic delusion. But every test pointed to one truth. The ingredients were exact, measured, intentional. Whoever had written the book had understood the chemistry of preservation. They weren't guessing. They weren't imagining. They were documenting. And now, tucked into a temperature-controlled vault beneath the university's rare manuscripts wing, the Patterson book sits in darkness, wrapped in cloth that cannot contain its smell. It is not read anymore, only kept, for study, they say, for reference. But there's a reason no one turns the pages with bare hands, not because of what's written on them, but because of what's still inside. In 2003, a university historian named Dr. Eloise Hargrave, specializing in colonial cartography and early American burial customs, came across a scanned reproduction of the Patterson boys' strange notebook, the one filled with hand-drawn maps of Holbrook and its surrounding land. What had initially caught her attention wasn't the elegant accuracy of the familiar landmarks, but rather the aberrations, the paths and structures that shouldn't have been there. One in particular stood out, the so-called Griever's Path, ending in an oval marked only as rest. Its shape was too symmetrical, too deliberate. It didn't follow the landscape's natural contours. It followed something else. Curious, she overlaid the map onto a digitized archive of 18th-century property records and topographical surveys. The match startled her. The roads drawn by Samuel Patterson didn't align with town-planned roads or known trails. Instead, they traced invisible lines between privately owned parcels of land, plots known, in church records, to have once belonged to families who each lost a child under mysterious circumstances between 1791 and 1802. When Dr. Hargrave connected the dots, the pattern that emerged bore no resemblance to traditional burial plots or ritual sites. It looked surgical. As part of a separate research project, she had access to anatomical atlases from the same era, hand-illustrated reference books used by early medical students, most of them imported from Europe. One particular 1792 folio from Amsterdam detailed the human body in dissected cross-sections methodically labeled from head to heel. Out of idle curiosity, or perhaps a pull deeper than she wanted to admit, Dr. Hargrave began to compare the positions of the graves marked in Samuel's maps with those anatomical cross-sections. Her stomach turned as she moved the overlays. The cemetery followed not the logic of burial but of dismemberment. The graves weren't organized by family, faith, or date of death. They were aligned like anatomical diagrams, each marker matching a different part of the human body. One row followed the path of a spine. Another curved outward like a rib cage. A tight cluster near the edge mirrored the arrangement of human teeth in a jaw. The rest oval was not a resting place at all. It was a body laid open across land piece by piece. It got worse. When she pulled the list of names found in the pine box beneath Holbrook's church pulpit, 30 children, each name written in a child's unsteady hand, she noticed something unbearable. Each name aligned with a corresponding section from those anatomical atlases. One child's name was scrawled beside a drawing of a trachea, another beside the wrist bones, one heartbreakingly next to a cross-section of the eye. They were not just names, they were labels. Dr. Hargrave wrote no paper, she submitted no findings, her notes never left her home. What she had uncovered didn't belong in a lecture hall. It belonged in the dark. She tried to rationalize it, to blame coincidence or pareidolia, but the more she traced, the clearer it became. The Patterson Cemetery had not been a burial site. It had been a map of something done deliberately to many. Something methodical, not a graveyard, a ledger, a diagram. And what haunted her most was the simplicity of it. Someone had walked that forest again and again, marking the earth not to mourn, but to archive. They had not laid children to rest. They had placed them where they belonged, according to some ancient internal chart, carved not in grief, but in grotesque obedience. The children weren't buried in death. They were preserved in sections, and Holbrook had not been a town. It had been a table. In 2001, a development company received quiet approval to clear what was once the Patterson property, intending to build a new access road connecting a string of private hunting cabins nestled deep in the forest. The land, long left untouched out of local superstition, had changed hands many times over the centuries, its history distorted by time and silence. Most knew it only as the place where Holbrook used to be, a ghost town swallowed by trees and forgetting. But part of the permit process required an environmental and archaeological assessment, a formality more than anything. And so a crew was dispatched to dig a series of test pits near the suspected site of the original Patterson cabin. What they unearthed brought the entire project to a permanent stop. The first discovery came in a shallow trench, bones densely packed, not laid flat like typical burials, but curled, upright, knees forced into rib cages, arms bound across chests in a position no human would ever choose to rest. The skeletons had been buried vertically, heads down, as if dropped into the earth like fence posts. Ropes still clung to the limb bones in several cases, looped tight enough to have left impressions in the surrounding soil long after the flesh had vanished. The positions weren't consistent with colonial-era graves or any known cultural rite. This was not a burial. It was containment. The team halted immediately and notified forensic specialists. Over the course of 2 weeks, a full forensic excavation was undertaken, revealing a total of 7 individuals across 3 small test pits. All were children, none older than 12. One was no more than 5, the tiny bones fragile, the skull still soft at the crown. Several bore markings etched directly into the bone, Roman numerals, shallow but precise, cut into forearms, shoulder blades, even across a kneecap. Experts would later debate whether the numbers indicated order, sequence, or simply ownership. The 4th body exhumed was missing its jaw entirely. Not broken, removed. Cleanly, deliberately, likely after death, but not long after. Another skeleton had what appeared to be a tightly packed cloth still stuffed in the throat, compacted so deeply that fragments of fabric were found caught between vertebrae. They were not clothed, no shoes, no remnants of coffins, only rope, earth, and silence. Soil samples taken from the surrounding layers revealed high concentrations of salt and traces of ash, suggesting that whatever happened to these children didn't end at burial. It was part of a process, ritualistic, preparatory. Even the burial sites themselves had been arranged in a loose spiral, though not one visible from above. You had to trace it with your steps, following the pattern out from the center where the smallest body had been placed, as if the child had been the start or the end. DNA testing was inconclusive. The remains were too degraded, too old, and no matching family samples existed. But the forensic anthropologists were unanimous. These children had not died of illness or exposure. They had been bound, silenced, and buried while still warm. The soil told its story through compression layers, movement, resistance, small shifts in limb placement as the bodies settled in. They had not been still when placed into the ground. News of the discovery was never made public. The findings were sealed under a private historical preservation order at the request of the landowners. The property was quietly reclassified as protected land, no longer eligible for development. A fence was erected, no signs posted, no mention made. But the forensic lead kept one photograph, a personal copy. It showed the smallest body curled in that impossible way, hands pulled up to the face as if trying to block light that would never come. The spine curved unnaturally, bent to fit a space never meant for life. And on the inside of the left femur, barely visible beneath a crust of soil, a single word had been scratched into the bone, hollow. It was the only word found across any of them, but it was enough. It spoke of what the Pattersons had done, not just in method, but in belief, that something inside the body had to be emptied, preserved, archived, and if that meant burying it alive, so be it. The children had not been lost. They had been placed, filed. Halbrook had always been quiet, but now it was clear. It had never been empty. In the spring of 1803, the state of New York quietly enacted new regulations requiring all townships, no matter how small or remote, to maintain centralized death certificates, official burial records, and standardized cemetery logs. The legislation passed with little debate, folded between agricultural tax codes and rural infrastructure proposals. To most, it seemed administrative, a tedious but necessary bureaucratic update in a post-war state still defining itself. But buried deep in the preamble was a line that troubled certain historians for generations. In light of recent failures in record-keeping that permitted misrepresentation of the dead, it didn't name the place, it didn't mention the town. But for those who had spent years studying frontier disappearances and undocumented settlements, one name lingered beneath the ink: Halbrook. By then, Halbrook no longer existed. The town had begun to fracture even before the law passed. Families moved away without explanation. The church closed its doors. The schoolhouse fell into ruin. No public statement was made about the Patterson family, but everyone knew something had happened. The Pattersons were simply gone. Their home burned to its foundation one night without witness. Some said lightning. Others muttered it had been deliberate. Either way, by the time the first state official arrived months later to verify new land plats, there was nothing left but stone, smoke-scarred trees, and silence. No arrests were made, no indictments handed down, no bodies officially recovered. The children who vanished from the town across the 1790s remained unreported because no one had ever written them down in the first place. No burial logs had been kept, no death registers submitted. In the eyes of the state, no one had died, which meant legally no one had been lost. That was the failure, that was the fear. Legislators may not have known the full truth, may never have seen the pine box of names or the cellar beneath the Pattersons' home. But whispers reached Albany, a town with no graves, a community that buried its questions instead of its dead, and a family that had vanished just as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind only rumor, unease, and a kind of grief that had no form. The new law made burial a civic act. Every death had to be recorded. Every grave had to be tied to a name. Priests and town clerks were required to submit monthly logs, and penalties were introduced for failure to do so. It was the state's way of taking back control from the wilderness, from what had slipped between the cracks when people like the Pattersons moved in with no past and disappeared without consequence. Still, no one ever spoke the name Halbrook aloud in chambers. No one dared. The record simply showed that the town dissolved in 1803, land redistributed, names struck from official directories. But local families remembered, quietly. And for generations, they passed down warnings. Don't let your children wander. Don't go past the woods, and always, always mark the dead. There is no marker where the town once stood, no plaque, no memorial, just a stretch of forest that never quite feels warm even in summer. A place where no birds nest, a place where the ground stays soft. But the law remains, a line in state code, dusty and overlooked but still active. Not because of faith, not because of order, but because once there was a town that forgot to count its dead. Or worse, chose not to. And something in the state decided that mistake